He lifted his crystal glass with the kind of smile only men intoxicated by power could wear, fully convinced that the woman standing below him was about to become the evening's favorite joke. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe dignity still matters in a world ruled by money, hit like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us why respect should never be sold. Now, back to Emily Carter. The Waldorf Meridian Ballroom in Midtown Manhattan glittered like a monument built for ego. Golden chandeliers poured warm light over marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected every pair of imported Italian shoes crossing them. Waiters moved silently with silver trays of champagne. Investors in black tuxedos and women in diamond necklaces formed little islands of whispered wealth, discussing mergers, acquisitions, and tax shelters as if ordinary human problems did not exist beyond those velvet walls. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, 52 years old, white-haired at the temples, 6'2", dressed in a midnight black custom suit that looked as expensive as the private jets he liked to mention in interviews. Richard had built Whitmore Capital into a financial empire worth several $1 billion, but those who knew him best understood something darker. He did not simply enjoy winning. He enjoyed watching people realize they had already lost. His favorite entertainment was humiliation dressed up as sophistication. And tonight, his eyes had found a target. Emily Carter looked painfully out of place among Manhattan's elite. She was 39, white, slim, her chestnut hair tied back in a low practical knot. No diamonds touched her neck. No designer logo clung to her shoulders. She wore a simple navy dress that might have cost less than one guest's silk pocket square, and in her hand was an old grey laptop with worn edges that made her look more like an underpaid office worker than someone invited to a $10 billion hedge fund gala. A few guests had already mistaken her for event staff. Others simply ignored her. Emily seemed comfortable with that. Her eyes moved quietly across the giant digital presentation behind Richard's stage, studying rows of market projections and colorful growth curves while everyone else admired the man presenting them. Richard was midway through his keynote speech, boasting about his newest predictive investment model, a machine learning system he claimed could forecast housing fluctuations before federal analysts even noticed them. Every sentence he spoke dripped with self-congratulation. Every graph earned obedient nods from the crowd. Then, in a silence between applause, a soft female voice rose from near the back. Your exposure ratio collapses if the housing index shifts by 1.8%. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it cut through the ballroom sharper than shattered glass. Heads turned. Richard stopped. The smile on his face held for 1 second too long. He looked down from the stage and saw her, the plain woman with the old laptop. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone laughed under their breath. Richard adjusted his cufflinks slowly, the way predators circle before pouncing. "I'm sorry," he said, voice smooth as polished steel. "Did the charity table have a question?" A few investors chuckled. Emily didn't flinch. "I said the model fails under a 1.8% housing correction," she repeated calmly. More laughter this time, louder, because wealthy people often laugh when they sense someone lower on the ladder has forgotten their place. Richard stepped down from the stage with a champagne glass in one hand, smiling wider now, that cruel billionaire smile sharpened by an audience. He approached Emily until the spotlight found both of them. He looked her up and down, lingering on the old laptop, the modest dress, the absence of status. Then he turned to the crowd and raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, amusement dancing in his blue eyes, "I am now willing to bet $100 million that this simple woman has absolutely no idea what she's talking about." The ballroom exploded in delighted laughter. And Emily Carter, still silent, slowly opened her laptop. The laughter rolled across the ballroom in warm, expensive waves, the kind of laughter people offered when they were certain they were standing on the winning side of humiliation. Crystal glasses tilted. Diamond earrings shimmered as women leaned toward one another, smiling behind manicured fingers. Several younger hedge fund analysts pulled out their phones, already anticipating a social media moment they could privately mock later. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of it all like a ringmaster who had just released an untrained animal into his circus. His confidence was effortless, polished over decades of making rooms obey him. "Well," he asked, extending one hand toward Emily as if granting a servant permission to speak. $100 million. You simply need to prove me wrong." Another ripple of chuckles followed. Emily looked up from the old laptop she had placed on a nearby cocktail table. Her fingers rested lightly on the keyboard, but she did not type yet. She studied Richard's face first. Men like him always believed the audience belonged to them. Men like him never imagined silence could become a weapon. "Are you certain you want witnesses?" she asked softly. The question was so calm that for a split second, several guests stopped smiling. Richard blinked, then laughed louder than before. "Witnesses are exactly what I want." He turned in a slow circle, gesturing to the room. "Tonight we have some of the sharpest minds in finance, private equity, and venture capital under one roof. Senators, regulators, institutional investors. Please, by all means, let them witness this." Applause broke out. Someone whistled. Emily gave a small nod, as if he had just signed something invisible. Near the front row, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Langford, chief compliance officer for one of the nation's largest pension funds, narrowed her eyes. Unlike the others, she was not laughing. She had spent 30 years in boardrooms and had learned one expensive lesson: truly foolish people spoke loudly, but truly dangerous people spoke quietly. Emily finally opened the laptop. The machine was old enough that its hinges creaked faintly, a ridiculous sound in a room filled with billion-dollar confidence. Richard smirked at the sight. "Should we get someone from maintenance to help with that relic?" More laughter. Emily ignored him. Her eyes scanned the giant projection behind him, where his famous Whitmore quantum housing model still glowed in blue and gold on a 40-foot screen. Curves rose elegantly. Profit forecasts looked almost poetic. To everyone in the ballroom, it resembled genius. To Emily, it looked like a lie wearing makeup. "You are using a delayed volatility adjustment," she said. Richard swirled his champagne. "Of course I am. And you buried the residential foreclosure exposure inside municipal bond proxies." Richard's smile held, but the muscles around his jaw shifted almost invisibly. Patricia Langford straightened in her chair. A younger investor frowned at the screen. Emily continued, voice level, unhurried. "Which means your projected safety buffer is false. If housing slips by 1.8%, your leveraged derivatives chain snaps in under 72 hours. This time the room did not laugh immediately. There was a pause. A small one, but real. Richard took a sip before answering, buying himself 3 seconds. "That is an interesting collection of words," he said with a dismissive grin. "Did you memorize them from an economics podcast?" The crowd laughed again, relieved to be told they should. Emily finally began typing. Her fingers moved with controlled speed, not rushed, not theatrical, just precise. Numbers started appearing on her small screen. Richard glanced casually, still smiling, but something unfamiliar had entered his eyes now. Irritation. He had expected panic. He had expected stammering. He had expected a simple woman collapsing under expensive pressure. What he saw instead was concentration so complete it made him feel, for the first time that evening, slightly outside his own script. Patricia Langford leaned toward the investor beside her and whispered, "Do not laugh yet." Across the ballroom, the giant projector suddenly flickered as Emily connected her laptop to the presentation feed. Blue graphs vanished. A black spreadsheet replaced them. Then lines of red numbers began crawling upward. The room went quiet. Red numbers climbed the 40-foot screen like a financial heartbeat going into distress, and for the first time that evening no one in the Waldorf Meridian ballroom seemed interested in their champagne. Conversations died mid-whisper. A waiter stopped so abruptly near the west column that the ice in his silver tray rattled louder than anyone expected. Richard Whitmore stared at the projection, still holding his glass, but his smile had begun to stiffen at the edges. Emily Carter did not look at him. She looked only at the data. "These are your municipal bond shields," she said, her voice steady enough to make each word feel heavier than the last. "You categorize distressed suburban mortgage bundles as low-volatility public instruments." Patricia Langford rose halfway from her chair. "That is impossible," one investor muttered. Emily pressed another key. 3 columns expanded, revealing date stamps, transfer layers, and coded fund migrations. "Not impossible," she replied. "Just concealed behind for shell allocations and a delayed risk assumption." The silence deepened. Richard finally laughed, but it came out thinner now, more mechanical than amused. "You are manipulating numbers without context," he said sharply. "Anyone can make a spreadsheet look dramatic." Emily turned her face toward him, and there was something unnerving in how little emotion she carried. No anger. No triumph. Just certainty. "Then provide the context," she said. Richard opened his mouth, but Patricia Langford's voice cut in from the front row. "Richard, answer the woman." Heads turned. Patricia was not a minor guest. Her pension fund controlled billions in retirement assets, and Whitmore Capital had spent 6 months trying to secure her confidence. Richard adjusted his tie. "Patricia, this is a misunderstanding engineered for attention." Emily typed again. A new graph appeared, this one far uglier than the polished curves Richard had presented earlier. The red slope dropped like a cliff. Audible gasps moved through the room. "This is what happens if the National Housing Index softens by 1.8%, Emily said. "Your derivatives do not absorb the shock. They amplify it. Within 72 hours. Your partner funds begin forced liquidation. Within 6 days, pension-linked accounts lose 23%. Municipal insurance bonds collapse next." Patricia's face drained of color. A younger analyst whispered, "That would trigger a chain event." Emily nodded slightly. "Yes. It would." Richard set his champagne down too quickly, the crystal striking the table with a hard click. "Enough," he snapped. "You are making broad assumptions from partial public data." Emily finally looked at him fully. "No, Richard. I am using your private assumptions." The room froze. Richard blinked once. Then twice. "What did you say?" Emily reached into her navy handbag and removed a folded cream envelope. It was old at the corners, as though carried for a long time. She placed it beside the laptop. 3 years ago, Whitmore Capital acquired the quantum housing stress engine from a dissolved consultancy in Connecticut. Richard's face did not move, but something behind his eyes recoiled. Emily continued. "You paid $6.4 million for it through a blind intermediary so no one would know where it came from." Patricia slowly sat back down, stunned. Several investors exchanged confused looks. Richard forced a scoff. "You are reciting corporate trivia." Emily unfolded the envelope and slid out a single-signed document. Even from 20 feet away, the signature at the bottom was visible on the projection camera once she placed it under the lens. A collective murmur swept the ballroom. "Corporate trivia," Emily said softly, "does not usually include the original architect's signature." Richard stepped forward so suddenly that one of his attorneys beside the stage grabbed his sleeve. He did not notice. His blue eyes locked onto the name projected in black ink across the giant screen. Dr. Emily Carter. The old banker near the center table stood up so fast his chair scraped the marble. His voice trembled with disbelief. "My God," he whispered. "Whitmore stole her model." And Richard Whitmore's smile vanished completely. There are moments when arrogance does not collapse with noise, but with a single name spoken aloud in the wrong room. Dr. Emily Carter. The words hung over the ballroom like a verdict no amount of money could appeal. Richard Whitmore remained frozen beside the cocktail table, one hand still hovering near the abandoned champagne glass, his knuckles pale now against the dark silk of his sleeve. Around him, Manhattan's finest investors were no longer smiling. They were calculating. Wealthy people can forgive many sins, but they never forgive being made to look foolish with their own money. Emily stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, her old laptop humming softly, the signed development agreement still projected behind her for every guest to read. Patricia Langford stepped forward first. "Dr. Emily Carter," she repeated, slower this time, searching the woman's face as if trying to match it with an older memory buried under years of board meetings and headlines. "The quantitative risk pioneer from New Haven Analytics." Emily gave a small nod. A murmur rolled through the room again, but this murmur was different. This was recognition, and recognition is far more dangerous than ridicule. A venture capitalist near the bar whispered, "She disappeared after the foreclosure crash." Another answered, "No, she resigned." Said the banks were weaponizing her work. Richard found his voice at last. "This is absurd," he said, though his usual command had thinned into irritation. A disgruntled consultant with an old signature does not invalidate an industry-leading platform. Emily turned another page from the cream envelope and placed it under the camera lens. Internal correspondence. Licensing amendments. Handwritten revisions in blue ink. Her blue ink. "I did not consult on your platform," she said quietly. "I built the core engine. You purchased it after my firm was forced into bankruptcy." Richard stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Your firm failed because your model was incomplete." Emily's eyes lifted to meet his, calm as still water. "My firm failed because investors like you stripped out the safety triggers that made the model honest." The room went silent again. No one touched their drinks now. No one even pretended to check their phones. Richard looked around, expecting support, but support had begun to evaporate from every expensive face surrounding him. Patricia folded her arms. "Richard," she said, each syllable colder than Manhattan winter, "did you remove the foreclosure shock barriers?" Richard laughed once, but there was no confidence left in it. "Every institution modifies purchase tools." "That is not what she asked," Patricia replied. Across the hall, an elderly banker named Samuel Denton slowly removed his glasses. Samuel had survived 3 recessions, 2 Senate inquiries, and enough market collapses to recognize the smell of concealed risk before younger men even sensed smoke. He stared at the red graph on the giant screen, then at Emily. "Dr. Carter," he said, voice low, "if the original safeguards were removed, how exposed are the linked retirement funds?" Emily inhaled once. She knew what that answer would do. But she had not come here to be merciful. "Approximately $87 billion in indirect civilian retirement exposure," she said. Audible gasps. One woman near the donor table actually grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Samuel Denton shut his eyes for a brief second. Patricia whispered, "Good Lord." Richard stepped forward, this time with anger overtaking polish. "You are fear-mongering from speculative assumptions." Emily tapped 3 final keys. New account numbers appeared. Pension indexes. Teacher retirement systems. Firefighter municipal allocations. Veterans benefit portfolios. Every red line connected back to Whitmore Capital. A hush fell so deep the ballroom's air conditioning could be heard. Emily looked at Richard, and for the first time there was something almost sorrowful in her expression. "No," she said. "I am reading your own exposure map." And from the far entrance of the ballroom, 2 federal compliance officers in dark suits quietly stepped inside. The 2 federal compliance officers did not rush, did not speak, did not need to. Their mere presence at the ballroom entrance sliced through the last remains of Richard Whitmore's authority like winter air through broken glass. Dark suits. Silver identification clipped at the belt. Calm eyes trained on the giant screen where $87 billion in retirement exposure still glowed in merciless red. One of the younger investors near the back whispered a single word, barely audible. "Federal." Panic never arrives all at once in rooms like this. First it appears as disbelief. Then distance. Then everyone starts stepping away from the person who was untouchable 10 minutes earlier. Richard felt it immediately. Men who had laughed at Emily were no longer standing near him. Women who had nodded at his every boast now kept their faces carefully neutral. Even his own legal counsel shifted half a step backward, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be noticed by a man whose life depended on reading subtle betrayals. "This is a private gala," Richard said sharply, turning toward the officers. "You cannot simply walk in here based on theatrics." The taller officer removed a slim folder. "We are not here based on theatrics, Mr. Whitmore. We are here based on a pre-filed financial disclosure packet submitted at 6:15 this evening." Richard's expression changed. He turned slowly. Very slowly. His eyes found Emily. She was already looking at him. Calm. Still. Prepared. And in that instant he understood something that made his stomach tighten harder than any market loss ever had. This had not been an interruption. This had been an appointment. Emily spoke before he could. "You wanted witnesses," she said. "I agreed." Patricia Langford exhaled a stunned breath. Samuel Denton lowered himself into his chair like an old man suddenly feeling every one of his years. Richard shook his head once, almost laughing from sheer disbelief. "You set this up." Emily folded her hands lightly over the laptop. 3 months ago, one of the housing charities I work with noticed a spike in silent foreclosures linked to pension-backed redevelopment bonds. Teachers, firefighters, widows on fixed income. People losing homes while your quarterly reports claimed record stability. Her voice never rose, which somehow made every sentence land harder. "I followed the paper trail. It led to Whitmore Capital." Richard tried to recover the room with anger. "You hacked proprietary records." "No," Emily replied. "Your former data analyst resigned in February and sent everything to the Securities Review Board after your firm altered internal risk disclosures." Several guests turned instantly toward Richard. One hedge fund manager muttered, "You told us that resignation was a health matter." Richard ignored him. His face had become a study in controlled damage. "Even if there are discrepancies, this is not proof of fraud." The shorter federal officer opened the slim folder and removed a printed authorization sheet. "Mr. Whitmore, at 6:42 this evening a federal preservation order was approved on all transaction servers linked to the municipal derivative chain shown here." He held up the page. This event was selected because key institutional witnesses were already gathered in one location. A hush fell again, deeper than before, because now everyone understood the same brutal truth. Emily had not walked into Richard Whitmore's gala by accident. She had walked into his fortress after quietly unlocking every door. Richard looked around the ballroom, perhaps hoping for one loyal ally, one familiar smile, one reassuring nod. He found none. Patricia Langford's face was ice. Samuel Denton would not even meet his eyes. 2 venture partners were already whispering to their attorneys. Richard swallowed, his confidence draining in visible stages. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question sounded smaller than anything he had spoken all night. Emily looked at the giant red losses, then back at him. "You offered $100 million in front of this room," she said. "I am here to collect it." For a man who had spent 3 decades making others feel small, Richard Whitmore suddenly looked as if the ballroom itself had grown too large for him. The chandeliers still glowed. The marble still reflected polished shoes. The waiters still stood motionless along the walls. But the atmosphere had changed so completely that the luxurious room now felt less like a celebration and more like an accounting chamber where every smile had been replaced by silent judgment. Richard stared at Emily Carter, trying to decide whether he hated her composure more than her evidence. "You cannot be serious," he said, though his voice lacked the iron edge it had carried earlier. A rhetorical bet made during a presentation is not a binding financial contract. Emily tilted her head slightly. "Normally, no," she said. "But your chief legal counsel drafted a formal challenge agreement the moment you wanted to embarrass me." All eyes shifted toward the tall attorney standing 10 feet behind Richard. The man's face turned a color no expensive foundation could hide. Emily continued, "You were very proud of your certainty, Richard. proud enough to demand signatures before witnesses. Patricia Langford looked sharply at the attorney. Did he really do that? The attorney swallowed. Mr. Whitmore requested a symbolic acknowledgement. Symbolic? Samuel Denton snapped. In front of federal officers and institutional investors. The attorney said nothing. Silence answered for him. Emily reached into the cream envelope once more and withdrew a single crisp document. The ballroom projector magnified it instantly. There it was in black ink beneath Whitmore capital letterhead, a challenge memorandum authorizing a $100 million transfer obligation upon verification of material analytical failure. Richard's own signature curved across the bottom in arrogant confidence, signed less than 15 minutes earlier when he believed he was documenting someone else's humiliation. A murmur spread through the room like a low electrical current. One woman near the donor table whispered, "He signed it." Richard spun toward his attorney. "You idiot! You instructed me to," the attorney replied before catching himself. That one sentence landed harder than any accusation Emily had made. Because now it was no longer her word. It was his own machinery collapsing from within. Emily placed the document beside the laptop. "I do not need your money for myself," she said. "I need your money where it should have gone before your model started swallowing communities." Richard laughed bitterly, but the sound cracked. "You think 100 million solves systemic loss?" Emily's eyes never left his. "No. But it buys breathing room for people who were never invited into rooms like this." Patricia Langford slowly stepped toward Emily now, no longer as a spectator but as an ally forming in real time. "Where would the funds be directed?" she asked. Emily answered without hesitation. "Emergency foreclosure defense, pension recovery litigation, and temporary housing grants across New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. The paperwork is already filed." Another wave of stunned whispers. She had prepared every inch of this. Richard looked physically unsettled now, the kind of unsettled rich men experience only when they realize control has left the building and will not be bribed back in. "You planned the transfer before I even opened my mouth," he said. Emily gave him the faintest nod. "I knew you would offer something extravagant. Men who enjoy public humiliation always do." Several guests lowered their eyes. A few looked almost embarrassed that they had laughed. The taller federal officer stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, in light of the signed obligation and pending review, we strongly advise immediate escrow compliance." Richard turned in a slow circle, searching once more for rescue. None came. Not from Patricia. Not from Samuel. Not from his attorneys. Not from the investors already texting their boards. The billionaire who had entered this ballroom as master of ceremonies now stood alone in a ring of expensive silence. His lips parted, but no polished speech arrived. Emily closed her laptop with one soft click that echoed far louder than it should have. "Transfer the funds," she said. "Then we can begin discussing the rest of what you owe." No one argued when the transfer papers were brought in. That was perhaps the most astonishing part of the night. In a room full of billionaires, attorneys, regulators, and men who had built careers on resistance, not one person interrupted the process. It was as if the entire ballroom understood that something larger than money was being settled under those chandeliers. Richard Whitmore stood beside the federal officers while his legal counsel spread emergency escrow authorization forms across a polished mahogany side table that only an hour earlier had displayed imported caviar and crystal desserts. The symbolism was almost cruel. Richard's hand trembled once as he picked up the pen, and he immediately clenched his jaw, embarrassed that anyone might have seen it. But they had. Patricia Langford saw it. Samuel Denton saw it. Emily Carter saw everything. $100 million, Richard muttered under his breath, as if saying the number aloud might somehow make it less real. For a publicity stunt. Emily remained several feet away, her posture relaxed, her old laptop tucked under one arm again. "No," she said quietly. "For consequences." Richard signed the first page. Then the second. Then the federal acknowledgement. Each scratch of ink sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. Around him, camera phones were no longer discreetly hidden. Several guests openly documented the scene now, because public memory becomes ruthless when the mighty begin to fall. One venture capitalist whispered to another, "Whitmore Capital will not survive Monday." Richard heard him. His ears had become painfully sharp. He slammed the pen down after the final signature. "There," he snapped. "You have your theatrical victory." Emily did not move toward the papers. Instead, she looked at Patricia Langford. "Would you verify the receiving trusts?" Patricia crossed the marble floor, accepted the packet, and scanned the destination accounts. Her brows lifted slowly. "These are not shell charities," she said. "These are county housing defense funds, union pension emergency reserves, and veteran relocation programs." Emily nodded. Real people lose homes while executives rename the damage. Samuel Denton exhaled deeply. She already built the distribution architecture. Richard stared at Emily as if seeing her clearly for the first time and not liking what clarity revealed. This was not a random woman with an old laptop. This was a strategist who had measured every hallway in his empire before stepping inside. "Who are you now?" he asked, and the bitterness in his voice carried something new beneath it. "Fear." Emily answered simply. "Someone who stopped waiting for your industry to fix itself." The taller federal officer accepted the signed forms and handed them to his partner. For immediate electronic confirmation. A few seconds later, the partner's tablet chimed. "Escrow lock confirmed." The words hit the room like a gavel. It was done. Richard Whitmore had just paid $100 million in front of the very audience he had hoped would laugh at Emily Carter. A hush settled over the ballroom again, but now it was no longer tense. It was reflective, almost ashamed. Several guests avoided looking at Emily directly, perhaps remembering their own laughter from earlier, their own smirks, their own comfortable assumption that simple clothing meant simple mind. Patricia Langford walked toward Emily and extended her hand. "Dr. Carter," she said with genuine respect, "I owe you an apology for not asking harder questions months ago." Emily shook her hand. "Ask them now." Patricia gave a solemn nod. Samuel Denton followed, then another investor, then a state retirement trustee from Albany. One by one, powerful people who had ignored her 30 minutes earlier now approached with expressions stripped of superiority. Richard watched this line form around the woman he had tried to humiliate, and something in his face hardened into a private misery no public relations team could soften. Because he finally understood the true cost of his mistake. He had not merely lost money. He had transferred the room. And in high finance, once a room stops believing in you, the collapse has already begun. The line of powerful people waiting to speak with Emily Carter grew longer by the minute, and each new face in that line was another silent nail in Richard Whitmore's unraveling reputation. State pension trustees. Municipal auditors. Two private equity chairmen who had once competed for Richard's invitations. They no longer stood near him. They stood near her. The shift was subtle in movement but brutal in meaning. In rooms governed by status, physical distance is a language of its own. Richard remained beside the mahogany table, shoulders rigid, watching alliances migrate across polished marble in real time. He had spent years building this ballroom effect, the gravitational pull that made money orbit him. Tonight that gravity belonged to a woman in a plain navy dress carrying an old laptop. Emily answered questions calmly, never dramatic, never indulgent. Yes, the pension exposure could be isolated. Yes, emergency litigation windows still existed. Yes, the Federal Review would likely freeze derivative dispersals before Monday's opening bell if coordinated action began before midnight. Her voice was low, practical, exact. There was no revenge in it. And somehow that made Richard feel even smaller. He wanted her to gloat. He wanted anger, triumph, sarcasm, anything he could dismiss as emotion. But Emily was not performing victory. She was doing work. Patricia Langford finally turned back toward Richard, holding the escrow copy in one hand. How long did you know these buffers were false? She asked. Richard's nostrils flared. Patricia, I am under no obligation to engage in public speculation while regulators are present. That is not an answer, Samuel Denton said sharply. Others murmured in agreement. Richard looked around and saw what every dethroned executive eventually sees: no one was protecting him anymore because protecting him had become expensive. One of his junior partners, Michael Reeves, cleared his throat from near the side bar. Michael was 34, ambitious, and usually invisible unless Richard needed someone blamed for a delay. Tonight he looked pale. Sir, Michael said carefully, the internal reports from March did recommend restoring the foreclosure shock barriers. Richard turned so fast that several guests instinctively stepped back. Not now, Michael. But panic makes cowards honest. Michael swallowed. You rejected the recommendation because it would lower quarterly growth guidance by 11%. The room inhaled as one. Richard stared at him in disbelief. Betrayal from enemies can be managed. Betrayal from subordinates in public becomes a mirror. Emily closed her eyes briefly, not from surprise, but from confirmation. She had suspected greed. Now greed had testified against itself. Patricia Langford's expression hardened into something near disgust. You gambled retiree stability for an earnings headline. Samuel Denton shook his head slowly. Unforgivable. Richard raised both hands. This is how aggressive finance works. Every major fund in this room optimizes exposure. Optimizing exposure is not the same as burying collapse, Patricia replied. Her voice cut like glass. Several investors who had remained cautiously neutral now began speaking over one another. We need immediate board calls. Freeze our Whitmore allocations. Get compliance on speaker. Phones came out everywhere. Assistants were summoned. A donor event had become a live evacuation of confidence. Richard stood in the middle of the noise, but none of it belonged to him anymore. Emily watched the chaos with quiet eyes, then slowly walked back toward the giant projection screen. She touched one final key on her laptop. A new image appeared above them all. Not graphs. Not losses. Photographs. Families standing outside foreclosed homes. An elderly couple beside packed cardboard boxes. A teacher holding two children on an apartment curb. A retired firefighter staring at a notice on his front door. Real faces. Real exhaustion. Real lives reduced to percentages in Richard's hidden spreadsheets. The ballroom fell silent again, this time with something far heavier than shock. Shame. Emily looked at the crowd, not at Richard. These, she said softly, are the people who paid for your confidence. No one spoke for several seconds after the photographs filled the giant screen. The chandeliers still cast their golden light, but now that light seemed to expose rather than flatter. Expensive watches, silk gowns, polished cufflinks, all of it suddenly looked strangely fragile against the faces of ordinary Americans who had lost roofs, savings, and certainty. A retired school teacher from Newark. A widowed nurse from Hartford. A firefighter and his wife from Trenton. The room was no longer looking at numbers. It was looking at consequences. Richard Whitmore stared upward as if hoping the images would disappear if he refused to acknowledge them. They did not. Emily Carter stood beneath the screen, one hand resting lightly on her closed laptop, and in that moment she no longer looked like the overlooked woman who had wandered into the wrong gala. She looked like the only person in the ballroom who had arrived for the right reason. Patricia Langford removed her glasses and pressed two fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. Samuel Denton lowered his head. Even the federal officers remained still, allowing the silence to do what legal language often could not. Shame moved more effectively when no one interrupted it. Richard finally forced out a breath. You made your point, he said, but there was no authority left in the sentence. Emily turned toward him slowly. No, Richard, she replied. Your choices made the point. I only brought the projector. A few guests looked down instantly, unable to hide small flashes of grim approval. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time all night, the billionaire who had once commanded every laugh had no prepared line, no polished comeback, no room left to dominate. Because some defeats do not happen when money leaves your account. They happen when truth enters a room that used to belong to ego. Patricia stepped beside Emily and looked at the federal officers. "My fund will fully cooperate with the review," she said. Samuel Denton nodded. "Mine as well." Then another voice joined. Then another. Institutional trustees. Municipal boards. Private partners. One by one, commitments formed not around Richard's empire, but around repairing the damage his empire had hidden. Emily listened, thanked them briefly, and began handing over prepared packets from her cream envelope, every county contact, every emergency filing route, every legal liaison already organized. She had not come merely to expose collapse. She had come with a blueprint for restoration. That realization settled over the guests with quiet force. Richard had spent his life building wealth. Emily had spent hers building responsibility. Only one of those held the room now. Richard looked at the escrow confirmation on the mahogany table, then at the line of investors speaking respectfully with Emily, then at the photographs above. His shoulders sank almost imperceptibly, but enough. The arrogance that had entered with him did not leave with him. It died there, inch by inch, beneath witness and consequence. Emily gathered her laptop, slipped the signed documents back into the cream envelope, and gave one final glance toward the giant screen before the projector dimmed. The photographs faded. The red numbers disappeared. But the silence remained. She walked toward the ballroom exit with the same modest steps she had entered with, plain navy dress, chestnut hair tied low, no diamonds, no security, no celebration. Several guests instinctively stepped aside to clear her path. Not because she demanded it. Because respect had finally arrived. At the doorway, Richard's strained voice followed her once